All right, welcome everyone. My name's Lynn Poirier and I work at Live Oak Waldorf School. And I'd like to introduce to you Rev Bowen. He's a master teacher who has graduated 3 8th grades. 2 of those classes he took from 1st grade through 8th grade. He has also been a I can do this, the pedagogical chair at our school. He has been the administrator at our school and teaches multiple subjects. He's also taught at Rudolf Steiner College and has been a mentor to other schools, other Waldorf schools. So before he begins, I'd just like to go over a little bit of Zoom etiquette. You may have noticed that you're all muted. And if you have questions, Rev will have multiple times when he will pause to answer questions that you have, but please write them in the chat box and I will keep them here and I will ask them of Rev. He'll repeat them and answer them. This is being recorded, as you probably just heard if you've been on. And I believe that's it. So you'll stay muted and that's just for our recording purposes. So thank you, everybody, and welcome, Rev.
Thank you, Lynn. It's my pleasure to be here with everyone. My intentions are to give a little tour of each level of the school, but I think more importantly, I'm going to try and touch on some basic principles that are reflected in the curriculum, but are based primarily in the pedagogy. And so I want to make sure we're all clear about those two terms before we start. Curriculum is the set of lessons and materials and things that we present to the students. Pedagogy is the philosophical foundation for how to present a curriculum. And it's the pedagogy, not the curriculum, that makes Waldorf education unique. So that is going to be our primary concern tonight. Certainly you'll get a taste for the curriculum throughout the school, throughout the early grades, early childhood programs through 8th grade. But I hope that you have a deeper appreciation for the pedagogy by the time we're finished tonight. So I'm going to start with a little story. I'm not going to tell it in full as I would to students, just to save a little bit of time, but I love this story and I think it's going to help us have an imagination to work with along the way tonight. This is called The Language of Animals. It's a Grimm's fairy tale. Oh, and I have to say something else before I start. Oh, I was so ready to start too. In this story, as it's written, as it's recorded from the oral folk tradition of Germany, there is this creature that is a white snake. And I just want to say, you know, in today's climate, I want to make it clear what my intentions are about saying a white snake. And it has nothing to do with race or any color differential. I think my impression of its presence in the story is that a white snake would be incredibly rare, incredibly rare. So it's very unique, it's special. But if it were concerning to someone, for the purposes of this story, you could say that it was a rainbow snake. You could say that it was a golden snake. You could say the snake was glowing. The significance for the child listener has nothing to do with skin color. It has to do with this being a very special, very unique creature in the story. So I just want to say that. And now I'll begin. Long ago, there was a queen who was able to answer anyone's questions with the most amazing accuracy. She seemed to know things that should not have been known to her, as if messages traveled to her through the air. Her wisdom was so great, it seemed to know no bounds, and she had the answers to all types of questions that were brought before her. As it so happens, at noon each day, the queen would have her lunch, and after lunch had been served, she had one particular servant who brought her one more dish. The room was cleared, and the queen was left alone to eat of this particular dish. Always the dish was brought in covered, and when the servant returned to take it away, it was covered again, so the servant never knew what it was that the queen was eating. In time, however, curiosity overcame the servant, and so the servant took the dish, having removed it from the queen's dining table, to his room. And there, in the quiet recess of his room, the servant uncovered the dish and saw a white snake. No sooner had the servant seen the snake than he was overcome with the greatest desire to take a bite of it, which he did. And as soon as he had swallowed this bite of the white snake, the servant's ears were filled with murmurs, voices from all around. He went to his window and saw two little birds speaking about what they had seen flying out over the countryside. For indeed, the white snake had given the servant this great and unique power, the ability to understand the language of animals. Now the story goes on. We learned that the queen is missing a favorite ring, and the servant hears from the ducks that one of the ducks mistakenly ate the ring, and the ring was taken out of the duck once the cook butchered the duck. And then the servant was rewarded and was given a horse and money to travel, and along the way, with this ability to understand the language of animals, the servant was able to come to the aid of some fish who were in distress, and then later, an ant colony that was in distress, and still later, some baby ravens that were in distress. And each time the servant was told for his good deeds, he would be rewarded at some point in the future. And is a common convention in stories. Later on, this servant was seeking the hand in marriage of a princess. This princess would not marry anyone who did not successfully achieve certain challenges. And of course, with the help of the fish, and then the ants, and then the ravens, the servant was able to achieve those challenges successfully and married the princess, and they lived a long and glorious life. This story, I believe, is tied to the creation story. I mean, there we have it right there, the forbidden fruit, if you will, something that when you eat it gives you knowledge of something you didn't have before. So there's and then the servant goes out of the kingdom, leaves the garden and goes out in the wide world and finds a way to use this new ability that wasn't originally intended for the servant for good. This is a very human journey story. But it speaks to something else as well, and that is this portrayal of the human being learning another language, learning a language that is not common, that might be difficult, but gives that person an ability, yes, on the one hand, but a responsibility on the other. So before I say any more about that story, I want to share one more thing that has to do with learning the language of animals. This is a slight aside, but I want you to follow me, if you will. In the mid-1980s, a man by the name of Pat Pirelli wrote a book on the theme of natural horsemanship. He was talking about how to understand the natural language of horses, wild horses, so that by understanding those horses and how they communicate with one another, human beings might enter into a more, a gentler conversation. And so take a horse from the wild and make it willing to have a rider upon its back. And I shouldn't even say make it willing, help it establish a relationship with human beings so that it would allow humans to ride upon its back. Though, of course, we know, we've seen the many portrayals of the other way of breaking horses, the Western buckaroo, the vaquero, rancho type of breaking horses, which is really just nothing but pitting the wills of two creatures against one another. The human being has the will to climb onto a wild horse's back. The wild horse tries to buck the human off as many times as possible. And the question is, who will have the stronger will, or who is willing to do this the longest? And so there was a very machismo type of attitude about breaking the wild beast. But of course, though it was successful, breaking the will of horses in this way had its costs. There was trauma involved. I mean, there was trauma for both sides. Sometimes the riders were injured, maimed, and even killed. And sometimes that happened to the horses. So it was not the most graceful approach to creating a relationship with these wild creatures. The ideas that Pirelli wrote in his book were not new. They were just popularized at that time. Media was making things much more widely available. And so he got a lot of credit for being this first horse whisperer, which I love that term, the horse whisperer, as if someone understands this quiet language of the horses. But we know that the ideas were proponed as far back as the 4th century BC by a Greek historian or a Greek naturalist named Xenophon. And then there were many, many, many in different cultures along the way. So what all of this has in common is that there's this ability to learn the language of animals and thereby establish a different kind of relationship in working together henceforth. We as human beings, if I may be so bold as to say what I believe most Waldorf teachers hold to be true, and the way that we view human development is that we human beings are having a human experience, but we are beings beyond these bodies. We existed before incarnating, before being born into this form, and we will exist still when this body dies. So as we work with children, I don't mean to compare them too closely to wild children, to wild horses. But I do want to say that it's important for us as parents and educators to attempt to learn to be child whisperers, if you will. We need to learn a language that is not so common. If we look at mainstream education, and I don't mean to throw it completely under the bus, there are many wonderful people working in mainstream education. There are many wonderful practices involved in mainstream education. But there are some principles at work in Waldorf education that I believe are very important for the future of humankind. And one of these is what Rudolf Steiner urged every educator to understand and to take up and embrace. That the sooner we understand human development, the stages along which every human being must develop, must pass through, must experience, the sooner we understand that, the more obvious our educational practices will become. This is why there's no kit, there's no box that you can open up and say, oh, this is Waldorf education, this is the curriculum. The curriculum is completely informed by understanding the language of child development. So I hope that helps. That's where I'm coming from. And I thought giving an imagination or a couple of pictures would help us understand it. So our goal as educators is to help children in their growth and development and learning to achieve each stage of development optimally. So that's a pretty important question. And there's something built in there that I want to touch on. This optimally part. You know, what do we mean in Waldorf education when we say we want to support a child's growth, development, and learning optimally? It begs a couple of assumptions to be questioned. Number one, do we believe that sooner or faster is always better? If a child can learn to read, for example, sooner, is that better? If a child can learn their multiplication tables sooner, faster, is that better? It is tempting, I believe, to think that it is better. But I want us to look at that, because it may be that we can accomplish something like the buckaroo who can pit his will against the wild horse and break it. He can accomplish that. But is there a cost in that accomplishment? What do we pay, perhaps? Is there longer lasting trauma from that accomplishment? I believe there is. I believe that, as with so many things in life, timing is everything. We have to work with nature. I'm going to give you another animal example. I like the animal world. I once kept chickens, and I raised them from a day old. I ordered them from Iowa. They showed up in a little box about this big, 28-day-old chicks. And so I had to learn a lot about raising chicks, and they became hens. They went through a molt stage. I'm going to come back to that. The molt stage was wild. If you've never seen chickens molt, that is a crazy time in their lives, and children go through something like that. But the thing that's important here is that these hens, when they're full grown, they start laying eggs, of course, and we can harvest them and all that. And I learned that if you put a light bulb in their coop and just keep the bulb on all the time, those hens will lay more eggs more rapidly and throughout the entire year. I thought they would only lay in season, you know, like when it's warm enough, they would lay their eggs because they'd have little chicks that need to be warm. But as it turns out, chickens are on a light sensory system. So if you give them more light, they will lay throughout the winter. This is how the black Australorp has actually laid, the record holder has laid 366 eggs in one calendar year, which is phenomenal. But these chickens, these hens that are treated in this way, live far shorter lives. They just, you know, use up all their life forces more quickly. So there's a cost to that accomplishment. And similarly, when we're seeing today in some of our educational systems that we can definitely teach children to read in kindergarten, we can definitely teach children to do math in kindergarten, to learn their multiplication tables in kindergarten. There are standards in some school districts and in different states that have requirements about achievement in kindergarten, academic achievements that must be met. This can happen. We can drill kids into doing lots of things, but what is the cost? The cost is that we are taking their imaginative forces, their will forces that should be used in free play, the same way that the entire animal world has all of its kits and cubs and all those lambs and all the kids, all of them, they play. And we know that as animals play, they're not just randomly jumping about. They are strengthening their bodies. They are gaining skills. They are learning to pounce and all sorts of things that will serve them quite well when they become full-grown adults. It's the same for human beings. We are not so different from the animals. When we limit that ability to play freely, when we hijack those imaginative forces that are the soul's way of playing freely, then we reduce the benefits that would have been in place if those things had been allowed to happen in their full time. This is why we don't do those things in a Waldorf early childhood program. We don't want to pay that price. We believe that when we do things in nature's time, it all works out for the best, for the whole human being, not necessarily just for test scores. So let me stop here for a second and say something a little bit technical about neurology and development. There's something else, just so you know that this isn't like airy-fairy, like, oh, I believe that it's good for kids to play. There's something that deeply fundamental happening when children play freely. I have given Lynn Poirier 4 links for articles to share with you in the chat, if that can happen, or if not, we'll get them to you somehow. You don't need to look them up right now. In fact, please don't look them up right now. But we know that it is scientifically proven that when we imagine something, okay, there are 2 things going on. So there's imagery. When we use our faculties for imagery, we are taking things that we have heard and seen, and we can recreate them in our minds. In other words, that's memory. But they call it imagery when we pull it up out of our own will forces. Imagination is when we take those types of things that we have experienced through our sensory perception, and then we innovate, we create new possibilities, we rearrange things. We can imagine places and scenes and characters and people that we have never experienced before. We as human beings have this ability. And they know that the neural activity in the mind is equal and sometimes greater than the actual experience when we imagine. Now, that's an important thing that I just said. When we imagine things, the neural activity in the human mind is equal to and sometimes exceeds the actual experience of a thing. Why is neural activity important, you might ask? I will ask it because I think that's an important question. When we have neural activity, different message routes, different neural networks are activated. And every time they're activated, there are oligodendrocytes that are aware of that activity, and they trigger a protective reaction. The more a neural pathway is activated, the more our bodies just naturally seem to understand, oh, we're doing this a lot. We better protect the ability to continue doing this throughout life. So there's an insulator that's created called myelin. You may have heard of the myelin sheath for neural pathways. And the more often we activate, the more myelin is created. And the more myelin that's created, the faster and more efficient those signals work along those pathways. And this happens particularly strongly in childhood, up to this point of puberty. It can happen later. The mind is very elastic, but it's much, much harder after puberty, and there's much less neural potential after puberty. So it's really important to have things activated early in life, but it doesn't mean we have to shove everything down as early as possible. We have till puberty. So when children are playing, when they're activating their bodies as they need to, not only are they building their coordination and their developmental skills, they are also enhancing and protecting their neural potential for the future. This is very important because those neural pathways can be used for lots of different things. You don't have cells that are devoted to one particular activity. Certainly there are centers in the brain that get lit up for different activities, but there's not a devoted pathway for one particular skill or action. This is why we can learn things even after we are impaired. We can learn, we create new pathways. So when children play and imagine, this is what's happening. And when we create the right mood, when we work with nature's timing, we are supporting it in the most optimal way. Yeah. So just to take one more picture of what can damage that, trauma damages learning. Stress will be a detriment to learning efficiency. We're always looking for the sweet spot in learning between comfort. Comfort is where we can do this, whatever this is. I can walk comfortably. I'm not learning to walk anymore. I'm comfortable with walking. Stretch is where I'm trying to do things that I'm not perfectly comfortable doing. That's the sweet spot. I am learning. It's maybe unusual, this new thing I'm trying to do. It's unfamiliar, but I'm not stressed out by this. As soon as I'm stressed, I've gone too far out of my comfort zone. Now I fall back into that fight or flight type of brain function. It's all based on reaction and instinct. There's a lot of fear going on. The adrenaline kicks in, the cortisol, all those things that are detrimental to the optimal stages of learning in human development. So we're always looking to find that sweet spot. And I want to say that when you have these, again, I'm not trying to throw any particular educational system under the bus, but when you have these standards being pushed lower and lower into childhood, there's only one way to find out if it's working. And what they do is they test. And I think a lot of us can relate to the idea that testing is somewhat stressful. Imagine being tested as a young child. Imagine that child who is so connected to the adults around them that they're picking up on all of their subtle and slight gestures and expressions, tones of voice. They know they are plugged into us intimately. Imagine the stress they feel when that teacher knows that maybe not enough of his or her students are testing well in that particular class, and the principal is going to be disappointed because the superintendent's going to be disappointed because the funding might be in jeopardy, on and on and on in certain types of systems. Testing is, it's just not supportive of actual learning, especially in early childhood. And today, with children experiencing all the strains of modern life, the ubiquity of media, the two-parent income households with both parents working, the therefore frenetic pace of life, the arrhythmic schedule from day to day, it doesn't really support what the young child needs. And so we're seeing more and more children today with learning disorders. And yet it doesn't matter, I just looked this up, it doesn't matter how many learning disorders are within the school systems that have to take those standardized tests. Every school is required that 95% of their student body is tested. That's a federal requirement. So despite the fact that we're seeing children struggle more today in learning, despite the fact that we know that lifestyle today is harder on young children, we are pushing education and standards and testing further and further down into the early childhood world. That makes me sad. Okay, I think everyone can appreciate that. I don't have to beat that drum anymore. So before I go any further, I'll stop here and see if anything I've said now so far has brought up any questions. And I'm fine if it hasn't, please. You don't have to dig deep here. I don't need to answer questions. We can move on if there aren't any. Lynn, I'm assuming there are none. You're muted. Is it no? Are you shaking your head? No questions. Okay, got it. Good. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, oh, there is a question. And I can't see it, so Lynn, you'll have to read it. But you're muted.
There we go. I couldn't unmute earlier, sorry. Yes, a question came in that is, I have a question about how the Waldorf philosophy helps to offer support for children who have gone through trauma.
Yeah, great question. That really is the point of most of this presentation tonight. So if I don't answer that by the next, well, it won't be so much the next one probably. Boy, you know, it's a great question. Can we just revisit it at the very end? Because I hope that what I'm going to present will actually give that answer in full. Great, thank you. Okay. So I'm going to launch into a picture of human development as we understand it in Waldorf education. And of course, this is all based on what was given to us by Rudolf Steiner, who founded the first Waldorf School over 100 years ago. And like I said before, it was Rudolf Steiner who said, as long as we understand child development, then we will find our way with the curriculum and whatever else the child will need, the student, the class, the school, and so forth. So here we go. There are some aspects of how we see the human being that are kind of like lenses through which we can peer at the world and at especially the young child in this case. So I'll talk about two things. There's a threefoldness that we work with the human being, and that is that there are certain types of forces we can use. Everyone's probably heard the old, it's really nice because it's HHH, there's some consonants there, head, heart, and hands. That sort of thing that's kicked around in Waldorf education. Head, heart, and hands. It's very nice. I would actually prefer it if we said hands, heart, head, because that's the order we're going to work through it in our education. And that's just alluding to a little bit of what I've said so far. The hands representing the body, the physical body, the will forces of the human being. And that's those forces that are just within us to do. No one has to tell the young child to try and lift her head. No one tells the young child to try and walk. We just have will forces that we are born with that take us towards certain early achievements. Now, as we grow and age, we have the opportunity to either enhance and support those will forces so that they are working as beneficial forces for the human being, not just in school, but throughout life. I mean, how many of us have had issues where we know, oh, I wish my will was just stronger. This year, I'm going to make a stronger New Year's resolution or whatever. You know, we have our intentions to do things, and sometimes it doesn't work out that way. That's all about our will. It's all about our will forces. So we can support those, or we can cripple them, really, honestly, in the young child and throughout our lives. Then there are the feeling forces that come into play. These are our natural emotions. As human beings, we have emotions. Some of them we are conditioned to think are negative emotions, and some are positive emotions, but I do not see the world that way. The only thing negative is when out of some maybe difficult experiences or difficult emotional feelings, we act poorly. Well, that's not positive. But the emotion itself, whether it's frustration or sadness or anger, those are natural emotions, emotions that children are going to experience. So let's break away from that conditioning of telling them what they are experiencing naturally is somehow negative. That's just crazy. That's a crazy way to start raising children. So the sooner we get away from that and just accept it as human beings, we have emotional forces, we have feelings, and it also relates to feelings as almost a perception, a way of, we feel things, not just with our hands, the sense of touch, but we can sense the mood of people. We can sense the mood of environments. The more that we help young children play with that and then enhance it, the more powerful it can be for them throughout their lives. And then there are, of course, the thinking forces. The thinking forces, in many ways, I think, are because we idealize this human brain that has become so big and enables us to do so many things that the other creatures of this planet cannot do. We seem to kind of highlight the thinking as that quintessential human ability or force. And it's certainly great, but thinking also gets us into some trouble when it's not balanced with healthy feeling and a healthy will. So our goal in Waldorf education is to balance the will forces, the feeling forces, and the thinking forces so that they can all serve along our way whenever we need them. And like I said, even we adults need our will forces. We need to be able to make decisions and stick to them. We need to be able to think about things, say what we're going to do, feel our way into that reality or way of being, and then have the will to actually make it real. We will benefit ourselves and our fellows. So that's one lens: willing, feeling, thinking. The other lens is a fourfold lens, and it relates the human being to the earth in sort of a classical way, and to the four classic elements that we've heard about, earth, water, air, and fire. And it also relates to something that we find is quite true in Waldorf education, and that is that human beings go through 7-year cycles. So I'm going to give a brief tour of that, and then we're going to launch into the actual programs. Okay, here we go. When we come from out there into human bodies, we are incarnating into a physical, etheric organization. So I've just named 2 of the 4. We have these physical bodies, which are basically, when I say that, this is basically what relates to the mineral world. It's the physical thing without any other forces involved. It's just a corpse. It's just a body. It's what we leave. It's what's left behind when we go. And then the etheric forces, as we call them, that you could also call them the life forces, the forces of patterns, of memories, of habits, the habit body, it's sometimes known as. These are, as I said, those life forces. It's what changes it from being a corpse to being a body that lives on the earth. Okay, now let's just take those first 2. The physical body is what we are primarily concerned with supporting and developing from birth to the change of teeth. That's roughly the first 7 years of life, but it's not exactly. None of these things are working on an exact calendar. But the truest sign that this physical stage of development is really coming to its completion is when the teeth begin to change. The baby teeth are falling out and the adult teeth are coming in. It's like and the teeth are incredibly physical, incredibly dense material. We know that the teeth are one of the last things that remain of these bodies. So it's like a flower blossoms right here. The baby teeth fall out, and then these kind of big, clunky things come into these little mouths, and then they're ready to bite stuff. and take on the world in a new way. So that is a clear sign that the physical development, this physical body, has done its playing, its free stuff, climbing and jumping and romping and all of those things, hopefully within a rhythmically structured day and week with loving people, all those things to support it. But the physical body of the child is through that developmental stage. And what is then born, and it was always there, all of these things are always within us, but they just unfold at different times in these roughly 7-year cycles. The next one is that etheric body. Now we see that habits begin to form, that the memory forces are born. We may have some memories from before our change of teeth, but by and large, we start to have much clearer recollection of our lives after the change of teeth. We see later on, around the 12th year of life, that the internal organs of the torso come into their rhythmic harmonizations, so that the kidneys and the lungs and the heart and the liver, they fall into their daily rhythms. You know, it's not until around the 12th year, for example, that the heart and lungs fall into their 4-to-1 ratio. 4 heartbeats for every 1 breath is roughly what the healthy human being has. That's just one example of the rhythms that are established during these years. It's a picture of just how important healthy rhythms are, because once those are established, much like habits are established in these years, they will continue throughout the rest of our lives. So if we have beneficial habits, if we have good patterns in place, if our development in these years has been supported so that our body naturally falls into these healthy rhythms that will support our actual physical health throughout our lives, we're in the best position to proceed onward, not just in school, but in life, in our actual health. So those are the first 2 bodies. Those are the sets of forces that we work the most with in this journey of early childhood through 8th grade. We get a little bit of the next stage before they graduate out of 8th grade. The next 2 bodies, if you will, or the 2 sets of forces, are the astral ego. We call them the astral ego bodies. Some people call them the astral ego forces. It really doesn't matter. What's important is that we understand, again, assuming and embracing this idea that we come from elsewhere and just incarnate into these bodies, we bring the astral emotional body, this soul body that we have these soulful experiences as human beings, and this ego, this I am, this centered me-ness, the ego. And I don't mean ego in terms of like, you know, a big head, like, oh, he's got such an ego. I mean, you know, that sense of self. It's very important for human beings to have. So first to the change of teeth, we have the physical forces. From change of teeth to puberty, we have the etheric forces. From puberty to somewhere, you could say, I've always liked looking at what was suggested, that maybe it's the wisdom teeth coming in full. That's about the time that we have the astral forces. You could say right around 21. That's okay too. And then our ego forces develop. So teachers of the 7th and 8th grades, sometimes 6th grades a little bit too, as well as high school teachers and beyond, are dealing with human beings whose astral forces are really coming to the fore in terms of how they relate with the world and what motivates them in their learning. And then the ego forces, that becomes really up to the self. You know, am I going to embrace and take responsibility for my own ego development, or will I just be more or less a teenager the rest of my life? So, yeah, I would say one more thing. Oh, I said I was going to relate those to the 4 classic elements. So physical body, earth; etheric body, this life body, water, just like we see on the earth. Water brings about life. The astral force is air, very whimsical, very all over the place, like emotional people can be. And the ego is fire, but not really, don't think of fire in the kind that just burns through things, but that fire, you know, the warmth, the light, the fire of transformation, the fire of being. The healthy human whose ego is coming in healthily is a breather, as fire needs to be, between concerns for the self and concerns for the other, concerns for the self and concerns for the world. There's a balance that we have to strike as adults between those two concerns. The self is certainly important. So is the other. So is the world. So those are the forces we're working with in those different phases. I could go on and on about them, but I know we need to move on. So I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions about that part.
Hi, me again. No, no one has written in yet.
Okay, good.
So-
I've either put everyone to sleep or I'm very clear. I like to think the latter, so I'm just going to stick with that. Oh, here we go.
Oh, at what age do the wisdom teeth come in?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a particular age traditionally. I'm imagining that, you know, today, because of the dietary differences as well as the lifestyle differences, we see things like puberty coming in much earlier in children today in modern times. So I'm imagining that may also affect other developmental stages, such as the wisdom teeth's appearances. But my wisdom teeth came in my freshman year of college. So I was 19. I don't know if that's typical or atypical, to be honest. But it was suggested to me at one time that maybe that's a physical representation of you know, the ego being about ready to be born, and that I'm entering a new phase, and that's why they were called wisdom teeth, because I'm becoming an adult. I don't know. If it's easier to just think of somewhere roughly around the year of age 21, go with that.
I Googled it. It's 17 to 21.
Oh, there you go.
Also, Mr. Bowen, I didn't post the sites yet because I didn't want anybody to get distracted. I'll do it toward the end if that's okay with you. Or would you like
See, that's a well-trained teacher right there. Because the children train us. As soon as you pass something out, you know, they're distracted. I learned that the hard way. Not that you adults would act like children. It's not you, it's people like you.
Okay, another question. Could you give an example of something you would do for kids entering the third phase to help facilitate the balance between self and the other?
Woo. Mm-hmm. How about, let's just work our way up to that. And we're going to talk about some things, especially as we get to 7th and 8th grade. And then I'll try to touch back in on because, you know, the self and other, boy, whew, aren't we all trying to learn that one? If I knew the answer to that, honestly, I'd probably be more active in politics. But I'll think about it as we're going along, how I might answer that more wisely.
Here's another question. Oop, okay. Does the Waldorf philosophy and Live Oak offer specific guidelines for dietary support that encourages a natural growth?
Oh gosh, great question. Yes. You know, luckily in this speaker series, I'm sandwiched between one of the great experts who can answer that question. The first presentation was given by Dr. Susan Johnson, and I believe she's still scheduled to give the third, if that's correct. Amber can tell me if that's wrong. But if so, I strongly encourage you to attend her presentation. Dr. Susan Johnson has spoken and written many, many things about how to support the healthy development in children, including nutritional considerations. She's a great expert, and she knows other people, both locally and further away, who are real valuable resources in that regard. I'm certainly not an expert. I know some basic things, but Those are the real experts. So I would defer you to them for sure.
Okay,
I mean,
what else is in?
the basics we know about, healthy eating and rhythmic eating, meaning, we don't just snack all day. We have meals together and we support that rhythm and give them nutritious foods. Here's a principle. The less processed, the better. The closer it is to its original form as it grew in nature, typically that's better. But, there's a lot more to it. Yeah, you're welcome, of course.
Okay, and the name, is that, I think you're wanting the name of Susan Johnson?
Yes,
I'm hoping that,
Susan Johnson.
okay, I'll write it down. Okay, I think those are all the questions.
Okay, great. Those are great questions. We'll move on. Okay, so we're going to start. Oh, yes, one more. I can't read it, so you're going to have to tell me what that says.
Sorry, when I mute myself, I have to wait for Amber to unmute me. So I'll try to wait for a little while. Okay, this is another question. To clarify the astral body and astral force, to clarify, the astral body and astral forces are the same?
Yes. Here's to give you another way of looking at it. These are mysterious concepts in some ways, because when we think of sunlight, we know that both are true. Scientists can look at sunlight in such a way that photons have actual physical characteristics, that they behave as matter. Now, very ethereal matter, but matter nonetheless. We know that physicists can do that, but they also have ways of looking at sunlight that it behaves as a wave, as a wavelength, not as matter, but as an energy form that travels as a wave through matter. And that is also true for light. So I believe human beings, our forces, we have to allow for that mystery that not everything will be understood in a mechanistic way. Not everything will be understood in a physical only type of way. So you could say it's a body in terms of it being those particular forces. I would say it's both in this way. The forces, if I were to say astral forces, they're part of how I work through this physical body. And because those forces are somewhat, connected or confined to this particular physical body, then it's kind of like it's an astral body. But I think it's more important to think of it as those are astral forces. They will come into, just like my etheric forces that give me life, they will come into this physical body and they will move on. They will not stay here. So if it's easier to just think of them as forces, I think that's probably the more beneficial way to hold it.
The person who wrote this question said that she was under the impression that astral body comes in during puberty. But if it comes in with the wisdom teeth, that is already close to when they are in college.
Oh, I'm sorry. I may have been unclear. Yeah, the astral body is born at the onset of puberty. So you could think of it as being a newborn. And then it grows and develops in its impact on how we are learning and being and interacting in the world. That grows and heightens throughout those years, and until the ego forces somewhere around the wisdom teeth appearance, and then it's the ego forces that are becoming the primary modality through which we interact with the world. I hope that made more sense. You're welcome.
She says thank you. Okay.
Those are great. These are all great questions.
Okay, I am muting now.
Okay, I am moving on now. So now we're going to take a little tour of the curriculum. So in terms of a 101 tour, now we're going to take those lenses that I've presented, remembering those will forces, feeling forces, and thinking forces, remembering these 7-year stages of development, and now letting those understandings inform us for why things are the way they are. Because I'm going to say, for example, when you stroll into an early childhood yard or classroom, or you just encounter an early childhood teacher with the students, you can immediately feel that something special is happening. And it's not just nicely dyed curtains. It's so much more. Everything that those teachers are doing is so deliberate. There is so much wisdom behind what they are doing. I mean, every aspect. It's just so beautiful. I wish I knew more. So what I'm going to give you about early childhood is really just a very superficial tour. I encourage you to take what I'm going to present and make sure you attend those parent meetings with your teachers. And nobody put me up to saying this. I'm just telling you, go to them with specific questions. Don't be afraid to ask them, why do you do this? Why do you say it that way? Why are you humming? Why are you singing? Why do you wear an apron? Why do you do anything? Just ask them all that stuff, because you'll be fascinated to find out that their answers aren't simple. There is profound wisdom informing their actions. But I will say a little bit. So again, what they are working to support are these will forces that are living so predominantly in early childhood, so freely. You know, you just see children just bouncing all over the place and running and tumbling and jumping and laughing and screaming and squealing, and they're just full of will force. And they're exercising through their free play and this will forcefulness. They are exercising their bodies, their coordination. They are developing so many important skills by just playing. That's so much of what they need. And as long as we can allow them to play in a safe place, we give them rhythm to their days, we give them a warm environment with beautiful people who are intentional in what they're doing, who are providing powerful models for those children to imitate, because that's another aspect of the will force, especially in young childhood. It wants to be part of the world. You know, this is why children are just so out there. It doesn't even think that way. It's not even like want. It just is. It just is connected to the world, to the parent, to the teacher. They're just so connected that imitation of their actions or their vocabulary or their habits, you know, sometimes we find out what our own habits are by seeing how our children behave. They're so intimately connected to us through these will forces that as long as we provide them worthy models, we're actually teaching them in the most efficient way possible. There's no abstract lesson. There's no needing to talk about it or explain anything. It's just, I do it this way, they do it this way. Of course, this can be impaired if the child is distracted by a preponderance of media or a schedule that has them, you know, lacking sleep or not getting enough nutrition, all those sorts of things that can interrupt this natural process, this healthy relationship. But if those things are in place, it's very efficient what happens when children are allowed to play and allowed to imitate and taken through rhythmic activities. They do a little bit of circle work. They hear stories in a nice little sweet way. They do some artwork with them. They act them out. They just do these simple little playful things that aren't too structured, that just support their playfulness and their soul development as well. So play, rhythm, warmth, beauty, good. You know, the world is good. To the child, the world is good. And that's something we have to live into. And those early childhood teachers do a phenomenal job of being good people for those young children. So that's really about the limit of my knowledge of early childhood. Again, talk to those teachers. They are experts. This particular school at Live Oak is just unbelievably blessed with some incredible teachers. So I don't know if you realize how lucky you are, but this is an incredible faculty of early childhood teachers. So, you know, I'll ask if there are any questions. I probably can't answer them, but go ahead if there are any. Okie dokie, we're going to move on. Oh.
No, there aren't. It takes me a minute.
Yeah,
No,
okay. That's okay. Yeah. Now we come to the grades. This is where I'm a little more comfortable speaking. This is where I've spent my time in the Waldorf School. The first thing is to recognize that along with this change of teeth that we see as one of the signs that the child is ready to move on into the grades, there are other things that these early childhood teachers look at with great insight. So they could, great question, I'm going to leave that to you. Go to a parent meeting and ask those questions. What do you look for to know that the child is ready to transition into first grade? It's a great question, great topic. I know that they'll be able to answer in much more depth than I could. But there's lots of things they look at. And then when it's time, the child transitions to first grade. Whole new world. They are going to be in a classroom now. Free play is only a smaller part of the day. We do have recesses, and we feel that free play is still very important for the young child, but it's not the primary importance because they are moving into that next 7-year cycle. Now we need to develop patterns and habits and rhythms that support their growth and learning. So we're basically going to engage them in what is known as the main lesson. And that is the first 2 hours of every day, the way the main lesson teacher works with them. It is the basis of everything else. So I'll explain the thematic work we do in each grade in those main lessons. But right now, I just want to give you a sense of the structure of a main lesson. So the first part of a main lesson in the early grades is often called circle. Later on, it might be called rhythmic activities. People are comfortable with different names. But the thing that it has in common is that we're going to engage the individual student and the class in ways that they move together. Individually, they harmonize with their peers and, of course, with their teacher. Those imitation forces in first grade are still very strong. They're going to fade over time, but they're still very strong in first grade. Like I said, these aren't hard lines that things just change overnight, but there is beginning to be a change now. We can still call on those imitation forces. So we take them through activities that support their development. A simple action, for example, there's a little verse called chip chop. And I was taught by my teacher trainer to do it in this way. Chip chop, chip chop. The woodsman with his chopper chops. It goes on and on. I could do it where I'm crossing my legs and my hands. I can do it where I jump when I do it. So there are lots of things that I can do with my body actively in time with my peers, speaking together, moving together. And here I'm crossing the vertical midline of the body. This is really important in terms of our neural and physical development, that we become comfortable and coordinated reaching across our midline. When that is healthily crossed and developed and sensed, we have excellent balance, but we're also activating both hemispheres of the brain. We are creating coordination across that gap between the two hemispheres, the corpus callosum. So there's a lot of basis in this. It's not just fun, although it is fun, and that's all we need to do is make it fun for the child. I'm certainly not going to explain to them how I'm activating their neural pathways. So there are lots of things we can do with singing, with jumping, with balance beam work, with beanbag work, with all sorts of activities to work on the different developmental stages. And by doing it day after day after day, we are just going to naturally help them work through things and develop more and more skillfulness. We don't need to test them. We just watch them. We lead them through these activities and we observe, and we can see progress over time. That part of the day is longer in first grade than it will be later on in the grades, but it's always, that part of the day is an important way to get things started. And it harkens back to, you know, early childhood, where we start in our lives with physical movement and working through our development. Then we come to a review portion of the main lesson. And the review is how we awaken what we have intentionally allowed to go to sleep. So we give them a lesson one day. We want that to go to sleep. We want it to live overnight, at least one night, sometimes multiple nights. Sometimes we revisit a lesson for multiple days. And that has a potentizing effect by letting something go to sleep and reawakening it. Especially we in Waldorf schools reawaken these things through artistic activities, through creating a drawing or creating a sculpture with clay or beeswax, or we play some music, or we act it out, or we write a song or a poem about that particular lesson. By bringing it through the arts, we're activating a lot of our human capacities. Like, we are definitely out of our comfort zone when we're trying to write a song about the fairy tale we heard yesterday. Now, I don't have first graders write songs necessarily, but I might give them 3 notes, and maybe we can pick 3 words from yesterday's story, and we'll sing them to those 3 tones on the flute. I've just begun, in the most rudimentary way, the process of writing a song, even with first graders, not on their own. I'll work with them as a group, but I'm beginning an artistic process that would terrify most people. Write a song about the story you heard yesterday, but first graders, they just jump right into it. They're willing. And the same goes with all the artistic processes. And so when we combine lessons with artistic processes, you talk about activating the entire human being in a beneficial way. That's really potent and efficient way of learning. So the review process is a part of every day. Then we take what we've reawakened and we put it into an actual lesson. This is what we typically see, the beautiful work that we see on those main lesson pages. This is the time where I have to say, I've said it to many new teachers I've mentored and those I've worked with in different trainings or workshops. We have to resist, and I'll say this to you as parents, we must resist the temptation to see the main lesson book as a product. Having a beautiful main lesson book does not justify Waldorf education. It does not prove that it was good. It doesn't prove that your child learned a lot or less. It's wonderful that we have beautiful pages. But what's far more important is that the teacher sees that in the creation of those pages, the child was striving, the child was working, stretching, again, out of the comfort zone and into that sweet spot of learning. As long as that's happening, it really honestly doesn't matter what those pages look like. For some are naturally gifted artists. They do the phenomenal work. And it can be really disheartening for the child who was working just as hard, if not harder, on their pages that didn't turn out as quote unquote beautifully because they're not so naturally artistic, but their work was just as phenomenal, just as important in their development. So I always want to warn everyone involved in Waldorf education to be careful not to celebrate the main lesson book like it is the proof that it all works, because it's not necessarily so. But after we do that work, and it's very important to do it with the students, after we do that work, then we end our main lessons. Not everybody does this. I'll acknowledge some people have different rhythms, but I was trained and I've through my work, I believe this is optimal. We end the main lesson with a story, and I'll tell you about each grade, the types of stories we tell. Sometimes those stories become biographies. Sometimes they become just historical accounts of events as we get older. So that's the structure of a main lesson every day. That's the rhythm that they go through every day. And it doesn't matter what type of block we're in. We could be in math or language arts. Later on, we could be in the sciences. We could be in zoology. We could be in geography. All of those subjects will come through that same format. Now, that format is flexible and certainly will be adapted year by year in each grade, but that's the basis. That provides the basic rhythm to every day. Yeah, so I just want to say one more thing before I ask if there are any questions about that structure itself, and that is how important, again, I won't try to beat it too much, but how important that story is, that we're ending the main lesson by engaging the child's imagination. We've done all this work from the circle to the review to the academic lesson that they've done. We've done all this work to awaken and enliven their learning, and then we end with this new drop of imagination. So the storyteller, the teacher storyteller, is not attempting to be an entertainer. If someone were to go on stage telling a story, that would be a very different process. As teacher, my goal is to tell the story in such a way, and I'm getting feedback from the students every day, to tell the story in such a way that I am, as well as possible, supporting their imagination process. The clearest sign, especially with the young child, is that they're sitting there looking at me, but they're not really seeing me. Oftentimes, the young child's mouth is even open. They're agape, They are so busy when you see them like that. They're not about to go to sleep. They are creating worlds from what I'm telling them. And if I can give them clues about, physical traits, touch and smell and sound and taste, if I can present things in ways that they can relate to at their age, if I tell it in a way that doesn't disturb their soul process, I don't need to be dramatic for the young child. In fact, that would pull them out of their imagination process if they got scared because there's the appearance of a witch, or start celebrating and clapping because George killed the dragon. All those things are actually counter to our goal as storytellers. We want them, again, engaged in that imaginative process that's so important in activating their beings, their soul forces, their thinking forces, even right down to the physiology of their brain development. So there, that being said, any questions about the structure of a main lesson or why we do those things in that way?
So far, nothing has come up on chat.
Okay. Yeah, and that's fine. There doesn't have to be. I just like to catch them when I can. Okay. In the grades, I said earlier, in early childhood, the sort of innate belief of the child is that the world is good. In the grades, they start off at least looking for how the world is beautiful. That's why we bring so much of the arts, besides the fact that it's the most efficient way to process things with children for their learning. It's also something our human souls yearn for. We yearn for beauty. We love it. It's why we recognize it. The flowers and rainbows and all of it. We just love beauty. So we are trying to, through the arts and through our own being, as well as those wonderful early childhood teachers, the grades teacher is also trying to be beautiful and good. It's very important. In fact, Steiner says, there is nothing more important, no matter what we teach, there is nothing more important than who we are. And the children sense it in ways that are far beyond any way to explain. So yeah, it's a little pressure when you, well, it's for parents too, right? It's for all of us. So it's a little pressure on us as adults. Okay, in first grade. So the story content is going to reflect how the child experiences the world. At this stage, they have not yet separated from the world. They're still very willfully, sympathetically connected to the world. All is one. All is one. They just aren't very conscious of themselves as selves. They don't have that ego at all. It's so deeply within. They are really just one with everything. And so the fairy tale, as the thematic content that we bring them in their stories every day, it is a picture every time. That's why it doesn't matter if it's historically accurate. It's a story. It's an imagination that every time is about the journey of the self. Every aspect of the story is an aspect of the self. That's just how it is. So I am, in the story I told you earlier, I am the wise queen who can already speak to the animals and understand their language. I'm also the servant who doesn't yet understand the animals. I'm also the animals who speak their own languages. All of that is part of me. And my journey as a human being is going through that whole process of being all of it. Children don't know that. They would never articulate that message, but that's how it is. So we exist in that world, the adults, we exist basically as deities. We are gods and goddesses. They don't question us really. I mean, they have wills, don't get me wrong. The 2-year-old will say the no, 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 and the 3-year-old will throw stuff and all of that stuff, of course. They have wills, but they don't really question us in a way of, what are your intentions here? Are you trying to manipulate me, mother? You're never going to hear that from a young child like that. Whereas you will later on. You will definitely hear that later on. So we are basically deities, and we're just part of the oneness. We might as well have created the world to the little kid. So yeah, the lessons are language arts and math. It's very basic. We're introducing, gosh, I could go on and on right now. So let me try to sum this up succinctly. Imagine not knowing any of that stuff. Like, we take it so much for granted that, well, yeah, of course there are symbols. There are letters and words and paragraphs and things and sentences and punctuation. There are symbols we use. And then there are these other symbols we use to talk about, numbers and counting things and the way to manipulate the way we count things, and all those processes of division and multiplication and subtraction and addition. Of course, there are all these symbols. Well, now imagine being a child and all of a sudden, boom, here's all that. You were just free playing and imagining fairies and gnomies, and now we're throwing a bunch of stuff up on the board and you need to learn that. It is quite a lot. And so it's so sad to me when I think of children encountering these symbol systems so coldly and abstractly, where somebody, and I believe this probably happened to me. I didn't go to a Waldorf school. Here is the letter M. It says Now remember that and apply that when you see it again in writing. That's kind of boring, honestly. There's not much exciting about that. It can work. These things can work. Buckaroos can break horses, but how could we do it in a way that really supports the child's natural way of being, this imaginative, playful way of being that they have? Well, if we bring it through our stories, I'm just going to take you through one example. I may have told, well, let's just take it right out of the story here. I'll challenge myself. Right out of the story. Oh, it's too easy, actually. I'll have to find a new one. The easy one is that you take out of this story about the white snake. Oh, the snake must have been laying on the plate in the shape of an S, and therefore from that picture that we would draw on the second day, then on the third day of a language arts block, we would say, okay, there's the S. We know that the word is snake. We're going to write the word snake. Oh, look, there at the beginning of snake is the letter S. S says S. Let's find a different one. Fish. Fish is a good one. You can make a fish coming up out of the water and see its fins like fish. Could probably do something with duck. You know, if you had the body of the duck kind of round and the head sticking up, you know, like a D is shaped, you could do something there. So my point is, what we try to do is make these pictures, these artistic pictures first. So first thing to do is they imagine the story, goes to sleep. Next day, we bring it back in an artistic process. And typically when we're trying to find these symbols, it's very helpful to do a drawing, something, you know, visual. And then out of that drawing, we can extract a whole word and we write that word. We haven't broken it into the little parts yet. We write the word like duck, or we write the word snake, or we write the word fish. And then we say, okay, now listen to those sounds. Here's that first sound. And here's the letter we pulled out of fish, that word that came from that picture, that came from that story. Here's the letter. Now, when we say, here's a symbol that we're going to use in our writing, it has context, it has meaning, it has a story. It's come on a journey to arrive to us. And that whole journey is something I'm invested in. I imagined that story, I drew that story, maybe we acted it out on the second day too. I am connected now to this letter, and we can do that for the letters of the alphabet in first grade. A very different way of encountering the symbols of this language system that we have in English. Similar with math, although we don't try to pull pictures out for the numbers, but we just want to activate their sense of numeracy by having them move in time, having them work with physical objects, counting, putting that counting into the body, into the activities of the body, and then we show them the symbols. It's not a speedy process. We're certainly not in a hurry to have them able to read numbers up to 1 million. And that's not going to happen in first grade in a Waldorf school. Because it's not that important. We don't need first graders to be reading up to 1 million. We just don't need it. What they need is to appreciate that numbers come from reality, because very quickly, in this grade journey, it's going to be harder and harder for them to remember how these sheets and these workbooks and these math problems that they have to practice, how do these relate to the real world? I think we can all relate to that question that is asked so often, especially in the upper grades by students. Why do we have to do this? Why do I have to learn how to do this? Why are we learning algebra? When am I ever going to use algebra? So to that, I just always say, especially to those boys, those questions come from boys mostly, honestly. And some of those boys have started doing things like pull-ups and push-ups and sit-ups. And I say, well, you know, when are you going to need to do a push-up in your life, right? You're not. You do push-ups because it's making you stronger. That's the same reason we're doing algebra. They don't like that answer because I just won. But that's how it is. So we are going to exercise the younger children on those basic numeracy skills, because it is both building something that's useful for them. They've got to be able to count. They've got to be able to use math in daily life. No matter what field of work you eventually go into, you're going to need some basic math sense. But also, math is so pure that it's also exercising in the very earliest stages of life. They're beginning to see, without us saying it out explicitly, they're beginning to see that there is an order to the world. There's a very clear truthfulness in math that they, again, we don't talk about it. That's quite an abstract concept to be bringing to a young child. You don't need to do that. But we expose them to it because it's self-evident. They can see it. They work with things. They see that 2 and 2 are 4. They see it. They experience it. They know it. They're beginning their first steps toward having a sense of the lawfulness and order of the world. They're still so connected to it, but they will further and further disconnect as they grow. Okay. On into second grade. Well, let me mention that along all these grades, there are subject classes that also support the child and are brought in ways that are appropriate to that age level. So we have games and movement classes. We have foreign language. At Live Oak, there's Spanish. We have handwork, which is working with fine motor skill and also creating practical things. We have modeling, often clay and beeswax. Is there anything else? Oh yeah, music, of course. There are music classes, and then a particular type of class that sometimes some teachers bring in a block form, and other teachers will bring week by week. I preferred the week by week as a subject class, something called form drawing, which is taking moving forms in space with our body, and then slowly but surely translating that down to the page. And so what happens on the page becomes an indicator, like it's almost like a footprint of how can we take things from the bigger world and put it down on this two-dimensional surface. It's very informing. And the more skillful they become with that, well, things on a practical level will improve, such as their handwriting. Now, not only can the teacher read their handwriting, they can read their own handwriting, which is very important. And their number work will become clearer, which supports their math development. So they can actually have an easier time doing their own math work. Okay, so all those classes and more actually will be part of the grades throughout. Second grade, we have this emergence of a, how do I say it? Their consciousness is beginning to experience polarity or duality. In other words, they're beginning to have just beginning, an internal sense or appreciation of right and wrong, of good and bad. It's very nascent. It's newborn. They're not going to be able to articulate and talk about it, but it's there. It's just being born. And we reflect that for them in telling them the stories that are part of second grade. On the one hand, we tell them fables, such as Aesop's fables from Greece and Rome, where we have these sort of rascally characters. They act in these animal level types of ways. They're kind of rascally. They're not evil, but they just do things that they shouldn't. The donkey dresses up in a lion skin and tries to scare everyone. And then the fox sees the donkey and just laughs because the donkey was so convinced he was powerful, he tried to roar and he sounded like a donkey. And so the fox laughed at the donkey. Stories like that are humorous, but they also have really potent messages. We don't tell them. And here's the moral of the story. We let the story itself speak it. The images are worth 1,000 words. And so we present these imaginations, these pictures, and it lives into the child's soul. To balance that, we have the saint stories, or you could say good people legends. It doesn't matter if they're historically accurate or true. It doesn't matter if you're Christian or not. It doesn't matter what tradition these stories might come from. The importance of these stories is that we have human beings who are acting in virtuous ways. They are rising to higher ideals. They are not acting out of a lower nature, but out of a higher nature. They embody goodness, truth, and beauty. Some of them have miracles attributed to them, but that's not that important, really. What's important is that they represent good being. And then again, out of those stories, we pull all the lessons. The main lesson work, math, language arts, it's all pulled out of these story imaginations. So they're connected every time, every new lesson. They have an imaginative and heartfelt connection to that content. Okay, in third grade, we encounter a pretty significant developmental stage for the young child. They go through something that's most commonly referred to as the 9-year change. And I like to break that into 3 parts. I think there's first a 9-year crisis, then there's a 9-year change, or sort of a growth and transformation, and then we see sort of an actual, like, comfortable 9-year resolution. It's most typically seen as the child starting to have irrational fears about things that before they would never have questioned, such as the child might ask the parents, was I adopted? Am I your real child? Did you actually have me? Was I born out of your body? But it's not just that. That's just one of the kind of typical questions that we hear about. I think on a more profound level, we have to understand that the child is going through an experience of realizing that the world is not perfect. Whereas before they were innately connected to everything in the world, including those adults around them. Now they are seeing the imperfection of it, and it's making them feel separate, which is, imagine that first feeling of that. If you may have memories of it. They see that mom and dad do things that aren't always good, like those saints were in 2nd grade. And teacher isn't always correct. Teacher just did something that was a mistake, because teacher's a human, and parents are humans. But they're seeing this for the first time. Of course, they've experienced it before, but they didn't notice. They were too connected. They were too one with everything, and everything was just good. Now they're seeing it, and it can cause some distress upon the first encounter. They also experience that they have an inner space where they can know something that for themselves is true, but they might say something about that to their friends, or even their mother or father or teacher, that is different. I know that I ate that last cookie, but I'm going to tell everyone I did not. And I'm going to look them right in the eyes and see if they can figure it out. 3rd graders sometimes will try this. It's playing, again, just like the young child was playing by romping and jumping and screaming and squealing. Now the 3rd grader, the 9-year-old, who's, close to that there, is playing with truth, playing with communication, playing with their soul experience of separation. It may seem sad to us, but they have to go through it. They have to. So don't get too uptight if you catch your 3rd grader in a red-handed lie. They had to do it. They had to. They might still have to experience some consequences, but don't get too carried away. This is a life phase they have to go through. Now, the change is the change can be supported by what we do to support their work through this distress. And that is basically helping them learn to feel comfortable and more empowered to be on this world where life is hard, where things aren't perfect, where even the adults around them make mistakes. And that's why the 3rd grade curriculum is so rich with things such as clothing, food, and shelter blocks or activities that teachers lead their classes through, where we learn with them about life on the earth. And this fits perfectly with the story content that is brought in 3rd grade. Now, the story content that is brought in 3rd grade sometimes causes some people who, especially those who have a negative association with the church, the Christian church, some concerns. We bring the Old Testament stories. These are the stories from creation onward, such as Noah's Ark and Moses, 10 Commandments, and all that stuff. We bring all those stories in 3rd grade because it fits perfectly with their experience. Now, there is this world in which at one time things were perfect. We lived in paradise. It was great. And then, we were tempted to do something we shouldn't. We had disobedience, and we ate something that gave us knowledge about ourselves that we didn't have before. And it's personified as this sense of being naked. which just means I'm realizing that I'm not one with the world anymore. I'm a separate being and I've got a separate body and all that. Then, because of that knowledge, those human beings, Adam and Eve, were cast out of paradise. They had to go out into the world where life was hard. Now they have to work for their food. They have to work with wild animals that might even harm them. They have to bear children, and it'll be a difficult, sometimes painful process. They are no longer one with Creator and creation. They are separate. That's the power of that story. It doesn't matter to me at all what religion it comes from or whether it's true or not. It doesn't matter. I tell every single story from fairy tale to the history of the United States, the presidents, to things that we know happened last week. I tell them all with the same conviction to them being true and valuable to the human soul. I'm not really worried too much about historical fact when it comes to some of these legends that we couldn't prove either way. But because of that story leads us through these experiences of being beings on the earth where life is a little more difficult, it relates to the third grader's soul, what they're going through naturally at that stage, this 9-year crisis. And then we take them through these activities that are about becoming comfortable with life on the earth, and they go through that change. Now we notice they become more capable. They're starting to understand. They're seeing how it connects them to the world in a new way, and they're developing abilities that they can fall back on in their lives. The world may be more difficult, but I'm getting stronger in it, and therefore it resolves. So that is a natural process the third grader, this 9-year change, goes through. Sometimes it happens before they turn 9. Sometimes it happens after they turn 9. But it typically happens somewhere within the third grade year. Yeah, and I just will say, as a set of stories, watching how the people develop throughout those Hebrew myths, I call them Hebrew mythology, you can call them legends, whatever, but watching how those stories unfold over and over, it's just the story of, here's a voice, here's one voice, the authority, in fact, what that voice says to Moses is, I am the I am. And that's a profound statement, by the way. Is it God? Why is God calling God's self I am? And does that relate to me, my I am? Well, yes, it does. But it's a story of this pure voice, this singular pure voice, telling people, as we do to ourselves as adults, we know what we ought to do. We tell ourselves what we ought to do. And these human beings repeatedly disobey. They keep doing the thing that God said not to do. And if you don't do it, I'll punish you and life will be hard. And guess what? Life is hard over and over and over for individuals and for the Hebrew people as a whole. They wind up being enslaved in Egypt because of their disobedience. It just goes on and on and on. It's a perfect story for these little third graders, these 9-year-olds who are playing with disobedience. It's just a perfect set of stories. Now, I'll tell you too, if you're concerned that your child might be taking in these stories and becoming a Christian, don't worry. Teachers should not be trying at all to convert your child to any type of religion. But more than that, I don't even think it's possible. I had a parent in my very first class who was very concerned. It came up at multiple parent meetings, just wanting to be reassured that I'm not trying to convert the child into any religion, but specifically this particular one, Christian, but any of them. And I kept saying, no. But it was a concern throughout. Well, then the next year we got to 4th grade, and you'll hear soon the stories we tell there. And the parent felt very relieved to see that the child had not become a little Christian. And so she was having a conversation with another parent who had this concern. This parent was a 3rd grade parent this year. And it was the student who spoke when she heard the mothers speaking about this topic. She said, oh, no, don't worry. I believed all that last year too. But by 4th grade, now we were in Norse myths, and she didn't worry about the Jewish people or any of that quote unquote Judeo-Christian dogma. Okay. So in fourth grade, the big theme is not so much with this 9-year change. Hopefully we've helped them resolve that. They're pretty comfortable being on the world, but what they see is that the world not only is not perfect, but things seem to be shattering. Things seem to be falling apart. Fractions, the fraction becomes, in my opinion, the primary theme of fourth grade. We have fractions in math. It's perfect that it's there in math, but we have it in so many other ways. Socially, you watch the child beginning to take the world apart. They're starting to question lots of different things, even their peers. Even socially, you start watching them form little cliques. Now they're very malleable. They'll change week to week, day to day out on the playground, who are best friends and who are the buddies and who's in and who's out. But they're playing with this. They're seeing that there are groupings and that there are divisions between things and people and life. And they're really interested in that. So fractions are perfect to work on in math, but we see it elsewhere too. We see it in the content, for example, that we bring them, these stories in fourth grade from Norse mythology, both the classic Norse myths as well as the Kalevala of Finland. We have these stories where we no longer encounter a monotheism. There's not a single deity now. That deity is broken, shattered into many different aspects. So we have Odin, wise all-father Odin. We have angry and fiery Thor. We have tricky and rascally Loki. And we have the beautiful Freya. And we have all these different aspects of being, aspects that they will try on emotionally and socially in their interactions with others. It's reflected in the story content that they receive in fourth grade. So, the fraction in every way shows up throughout fourth grade. We begin to take apart part of the natural world. We lead them into zoology, the study of animals, where they are seeing how each animal is an incredible, uniquely, very specialized being that in a few or maybe just one way is far more perfect, if you will, than the human being. And each one has its most perfected aspects, but the human being in comparison has similarities and has differences, but is more of a synthesis of the entire animal world. We have things in common with even the little snail. We have things in common, of course, with primates. We have things in common with fish. We have things in common with the koala bear. We have things in common with the birds. And the more they learn to appreciate this, they learn to see themselves as, yes, part of the world, and yet also appreciating each little fractional part of that, in this case, animal world, how it's divided out. Not only that, it harkens back to third grade in the most amazing way. The story of Noah's Ark, where all these animals come 2 by 2. Well, you know, if you actually read that text carefully, you see that the dimensions of the ark would actually create the perfect proportions for a human coffin. And so what we see is all these animals that come into that ark are actually fitting into a container that holds a human being. We are so intimately connected to this world. I don't say that, by the way, to the students in third or fourth grade, but it's nevertheless a picture that lives in the soul. They also study geography in third grade, so we begin to look at our world in a new way. We begin to understand that it's not just Earth, but now we're looking at valleys and mountains and rivers. We start locally, very locally, but we are starting that process of expanding their appreciative view of the whole world. I'm going to try and move quickly because I know we don't have a lot of time and I want to leave some time for questions at the end. Fifth grade is unique because it's kind of the golden age of childhood. They just come into a balance within themselves. They're happy, they're light, they're joyous, they're confident, they're skillful. We expose them to the traditional ancient civilizations of India, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, and ancient Greece. Those are the primary ones. And each one is showing these developmental stages of the human being becoming really well organized, really comfortable in the earth, and just really incredibly capable. Again, many deities. And now the stories become balanced as well as the human being is balanced at that age of childhood. We have the exploits of the gods and goddesses, but we also have the exploits of the human beings. Now there's sort of a mutually balanced influence and emphasis on both the deities and the human beings. So geography expands. Now we're not just looking at the animal world as we did in 5th grade or 4th grade. Now in 5th grade, we're looking at the plant world. So botany. And again, we see that we have some things in common. We have some things that are different. Each plant has its own special characteristics and abilities, all the way from algae all the way to the redwood. Okay, that brings us to 6th grade. In some places of the world, they refer to 6th grade as the coffin, because a certain type of heaviness comes into the child's being, both physically as well as on a kind of soul level. They're not as light and airy and balanced and golden as they were in 5th grade. But it's not a bad thing. This is a phase that we all have to go through. They are no longer quite so willing to accept that message that the world is beautiful. Now they're starting to see the world is sometimes not beautiful, and therefore they're wanting to know, okay, tell me the whole truth. So the wonderful thing, and here's where they're kind of like the molting chicken too. They're so big, they feel like they're big now, and they're getting to be adults, but they're still kids. So if you ever see a molting chicken, you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay. The students feel this sort of tension between wanting to trust in their authority figures and in their classmates and even in themselves, and yet they're still feeling this lack of beauty. And so the themes we bring them are from ancient Rome. Ancient Rome was founded by, we hear a few stories of a few legendary kings, but very quickly they converted into a system of organizing their society based on law, based on rights, based on a system rather than the whims or the dictations of an individual being who might be a tyrant and therefore abuse that position. They wouldn't stand for that. They saw the ideals of democracy that we heard about at the end of 5th grade in ancient Greece, and they're applying them in an incredibly successful way. The Roman Empire, of course, as we know, expanded to unprecedented heights. And then, of course, as they're experiencing in themselves, the Roman Empire also fell and shattered into pieces. And North Africa, all around the Mediterranean, was basically cast into a kind of dark age. What had held it all together was just suddenly gone. People were migrating. There were many battles and wars. There were famines. There were just all sorts of atrocities. And within this dark age, this uncertainty, there were these little lights of order and learning and knowledge and striving for goodness. And those were found both in the Muslim world, where Islam starts to rise, as well as the Christian world, where we have these monasteries and convents that are sprinkled throughout as these little havens of order and goodness and knowledge. And so these represent sort of a preservation of hope for human beings moving forward. They learn about medieval times, the beings of these nobility and knights who were striving for chivalry and goodness. They're really quite upright beings. We also hear we explore mineralogy, so they're learning about the physical world, this heavy physical world, and they learn that rocks aren't just things that are just existing. They actually go through a life themselves in a very long time spell, but they have lives and transformations too. So we have that in common, of course, with the physical world, even in its form of rocks. The astral forces are being born about this time. They're going through adolescence, or they're entering adolescence, going through puberty. And so these emotional forces are coming out. And this is why by the time we get to the end of 6th grade and we transition to 7th grade, the real question is, can you handle the drama? Because they're going to be able to talk and argue and question, but they don't need it to make sense. They can absolutely contradict themselves in the same conversation with you and do it with absolute conviction. And you as parent, and me as teacher, and me as parent too, we might be looking at them like they are foreign entities, like they are actual aliens to the human race. And in some ways they are, because they are just lost in kind of a chemistry experiment that is their body going through puberty, and their emotions are fluctuating with all the changing chemicals happening in their body. And they just are like ships on a wild sea, really, just doing their best to make their way. So we give them stories that will help them. We bring them to the Renaissance. This is a rebirth of beauty and order and learning out of the Dark Ages. We give them the Age of Exploration, where people are going all over the world, including looking up into the heavens and looking down in a more and more focused look at the small aspects of life. We also bring them the Reformation, where people are beginning to question this Catholic Church that had actually become its own type of kingdom, with this Pope being unquestionable as an authority. And people are saying, well, wait a minute, the Pope, this particular Pope has 3 different lovers and 3 different families. And the church just keeps taking money, but they're not, there are a lot of abuses at that time that people are questioning. And we have people beginning a reformation of the church. All of these are important things for the child at that age to see and experience. Of course, we lead them through chemistry because they themselves are chemical experiments. We bring them to physics because they need to be even more comfortable living in this world and seeing the order in it, just like the Romans wanted to see order. And in the Renaissance, these learners were looking at so many aspects of the world, looking for the beauty and the wonder and the order in it. We bring those through these subjects. And finally, we hit 8th grade, and it's basically viva la, whatever. You fill in the blank. They're ready to rebel against it because life is unjust and it's unfair, and I should be free. If I could encapsulate their theme, their battle cry. And by the way, they shouldn't win every rebellion here, but maybe we allow them to win sometimes. But their battle cry almost comes verbatim from the French Revolution, where the people cried, I wanted you to get this in the right order: liberté, égalité, fraternité. And that is liberty or freedom, equality, and brotherhood, or, society, equalness, healthy society. This is what the people wanted. They didn't want to be ruled by tyrants and nobility anymore. They wanted a well-ordered society that attended to those values for the human being, every individual, nobility or not, peasant, all the way down to the peasant. So this is what the 8th grader embraces. They're seeing that there are injustices in the world. They're not just like a 3rd grader seeing that there are a few imperfections and that sometimes teachers make mistakes. They're ready to declare everyone is wrong, and we could perfect the world if you would just listen to me. So ironically, they kind of become their own little tyrants. And if you know anything about the French Revolution, you know that a lot of people were decapitated in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But that doesn't stop them. They need to go through this. They need to, they're very idealistic, and they have to be. They have to strive for these high ideals and see that other human beings did too at one time in the world. And that we still are. We just have tempered our methods for achieving it. And then we continue to explore through chemistry, through meteorology. We look at electricity, we look at electromagnetism, human biology. All these things are helping them come up to speed with where we are in the modern world. And so the story content is leading them as far as we can. It's a lot to try and cover in 8th grade to bring them all the way up to modern times. But at least we cover some modern themes. So there are the revolutionary tales from Europe especially, but there are also explorations into China and Africa and India. There are trade routes from these different empires. There are ways to become world citizens and to appreciate at least in the most superficial way some of the dynamics at play in our world today, still playing out in our world today. Can't cover it all, but we give them some key and essential lessons in that regard. And then we also try to prepare them, particularly at a school that doesn't have a high school that's Waldorf based. We try to prepare them also for their merging into perhaps a public school system. So those are lots of considerations for the teacher to juggle in 8th grade. That's the journey. And that's how we're always trying to attend to each phase of their development with the themes and the content we bring in the curriculum. Whew. Any questions?
Not yet. We can wait though. I'll post the sites now though, as we're waiting.
Sure. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank you so much. Yes, you are welcome. Thank you. Yeah, basically the links that Lynn is posting, I just was doing a little bit of research preparing for this, and I'm always interested in neuroscience. I'm not in any way an expert in any way, really. But it's interesting to me, just if I can find people who can encapsulate certain discoveries from experiments or research that point to things that support, for example, all 4 of these point to research that really validates how important the imagination process is for the human being. And yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, we can have an innate trust in Waldorf education. I think that's valuable sometimes, but I don't want us always to rest on that type of trust. I want us to also look at research that shows us it's real. This is real. It's not a dogma. Waldorf education should not be a belief system alone. There should be research that supports what we're doing. So that's what those links are for.
A lot of thank yous.
Oh, I have lots of you're welcomes.
Okay, one more link. Gotta go back.
Yeah, where did Waldorf School originate? That's great. Yeah, the first Waldorf School was found in Stuttgart, Germany. At Emil Molt was the I don't know if he was the owner. I think he was the owner of a cigarette factory, actually. And it was the Waldorf cigarette factory, and he was a fan of Rudolf Steiner, who had been lecturing all around, and he asked Rudolf Steiner if he would help design a school for the children of the workers of that cigarette factory. And Rudolf Steiner said, "I'm so glad. I was hoping someone would ask me to do this." And so in 1919, the first Waldorf School was founded for those children of those workers. And Rudolf Steiner, I don't mean to sound like, you know, something that relates so much to Jesus and his disciples or King Arthur and his knights, but it really was. It was Rudolf Steiner and 12 teachers. And those 12 teachers were given a training that lasted, I think, 14 days. Maybe it was 16 days. I don't know, something short, super short. And then they launched. So pretty amazing story, actually. And yet, because those who were involved believed so much and saw the results so quickly of this approach to education, it continued to grow throughout Rudolf Steiner's life. And then he died in 1925. And it, of course, has continued. Now there are Waldorf schools all over the world. And we've, like I said, in 2019, Waldorf education celebrated its 100th birthday.
Sorry, I posted the same link twice. Let me make sure I can do that correctly.
Sometimes it's good to read things more than once.
Here we go.
Well, I do want to close then. I mean, it's fine if another question comes up, but I want to, oh, yeah, okay. I do want to close by saying that there are a lot of things I've said that I think most or even every Waldorf teacher would agree with. But the wonderful thing about Waldorf education is that it is based on an understanding of the human being and human development. And so there isn't one single answer that's always going to be true. As we encounter children, unique in their capacities or abilities or even their challenges, we have to adapt this curriculum and our pedagogy to meet them. So you'll never find two Waldorf teachers who agree on everything. So it's absolutely possible that your particular child's teacher could have a different idea about this or that. And yet neither of us are wrong. We can both be correct or more or less correct about what we're doing. Well, I thank you all so much for your attention and the questions. Here's one more about resources, but I can't see the rest of the questions. So can someone read that?
It says, are there resources for parents to engage at home?
Ooh. Yes, there are. I'm wondering, I want to get a little more specific idea of what's being asked. Do you mean for like just things you can read up on to understand Waldorf education better, or are you trying to actually implement something in your home? Because there are both. There are lots of resources, for example, for people who engage in homeschooling, taking what you're teaching. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, off the top of my head, I could think of a few. There's a Waldorf Parenting Handbook, I believe, is what it's called. It's got a picture of a green apple on the cover. That's kind of a nice, basic introductory reader for parents. And really, I guess I could have had a list of things like that to give you. I can't think of a lot off the top of my head, but I will get a list of resources that I know of, and we'll make sure to send them out to those of you who have been on this Zoom. Will we have a list of those who have, will we have that captured? Will we have a list of those who have tuned in this evening? Okay, well then I think it was it Jill, was that you who asked that question about resources? Yes, okay. So Jill, if nobody else gets it, I will make sure you get a list of resources in that way. And I can just say, especially when you want to fine tune it into those particular levels, such as your child or children's age or ages. Yeah, I mean, I'll try to send it to everybody. But when you want to get a more particular list, you can certainly talk to your teachers. Your teachers are using those resources as well, and they will have their list more fine-tuned to particular age levels. But I'll try to give some general, more type of introductory type of resources. I'll work on that as soon as I can. It'll be out before the end of this weekend.
Amber says she.
In the bulletin, that's great. We can do that. Yeah, that'll be our way. You're welcome. Okay, I think we are complete. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.